Welcome. My name is Brian Anquist, and I'm Teacher Training Department Manager for Pearson in Spain and Portugal. And I'd like to welcome you today to this first of our most recent webinar series, Success at Primary, where we're focusing on the needs and concerns of primary teachers. Today, we're going to be joined by Susan House, who I have with me here today, and she's going to be speaking about the IDEAS framework. I'll let Susan explain that in more detail in a moment. Susan is an accomplished author. She's written for many publishers. You may have used some of her books in the past. She's also quite an expert on CLIL, which is the focus of today's webinar. So I'd like to now give my attention to Susan and pass the baton over to her. So, Susan, when you'd like to start, please feel free.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We do appreciate it, especially as we know you've spent a long day at work, most of you. We're going to have a look today at what we call the IDEAS framework. And this is, sorry, I'll just put that up there. Okay. This is something that it's a framework that we have developed in order to try and solve some of the major issues which occur in CLIL teaching, in the teaching of CLIL programs. One of the issues that constantly challenges teachers when you're teaching CLIL is how do you bring together the learning of concepts, the learning of concepts, and the learning of language? How do you actually mesh these two things together, especially when we're dealing with children who are quite young? It tends to be easier as they get older, but when they're very little, there are all sorts of challenges there. And we sort of ask ourselves lots of questions like, well, what happens first? What comes first? Is it the concept? Is it the language? What do they do first? Do they learn how to think? Do they learn how to speak? Is there a hierarchy involved in here? What does both things happen at the same time? Is it the same as it is in L1? How do we teach new concepts? How do we get the children to actually get at the information when the information is in a different language? So this is a sort of like background of ideas, of questions, which lies behind the IDEAS framework. So in other words, we're asking ourselves constantly a very big question, which is, how do children learn? How do they actually learn? I'm not going to attempt to answer that question today, but it's a huge question. And my experience over the years is that we answer this question in lots of different ways, depending on whatever happens to be the sort of trend of methodology of the time. And it's probably an unanswerable question, actually. But what we can do is break the whole thing down into smaller pieces and look at it in this way. So the first thing I want to say to you is that we think of thinking as part of the learning process from the start. And that's the key question there, from the start. Thinking isn't something that children do as they get older. There is a tendency to think that, little ones don't really think very much. They just sort of blabber. But actually, children do think. They have to be, but it's not something that happens automatically. They will think automatically at a very basic level. But if you want their thinking to be productive, to be useful to them, and but furthermore, if you want it to develop, it is something that you actually have to work on actively. You have to think about it and do things deliberately there. Which happens first? Language, thinking. What do children do? Do they think first and then they use language, or do they use language and then think afterwards? Actually, I mean, these are sort of questions which have troubled linguists and philosophers of education over many, many years. I'm not sure I can answer. I don't think there is a very clear answer, but I think you have to think of these two things as happening at the same time, happening together. With young learners, it's really impossible to pull these two things apart, and I don't think we should be trying to. Notice that I say talking develops concepts, not language. Talking develops concepts. It doesn't happen the other way around. So they don't have the concept and then get the talking. It's by talking that they get the concept. And I use talking instead of language because it's not so much that they need to understand the tenses of verbs or I don't know, what's a noun and what's an adjective. No. It's not that kind of language that we're talking about. It's the actual verbalization of what's going on up here. You can see this very clearly with little children, because when they're doing it, they do it out loud. Whereas as adults, we learn to internalize this process. So we're sort of thinking the process through. Little ones are not very good at doing that. And so they'll actually be speaking it as they're doing it. You watch children playing with something like a puzzle or a construction game, and they're talking the way, I'm going to put this on here, and now, and where's that over there? And they're talking to themselves. They're not talking to anybody else, but it's their way of actually controlling their thoughts. And so children learn and understand because they talk, but not before they talk. Right? It's the talking that's really, really important. And this is something which challenges the CLIL, it challenges the ELT classroom, but it also challenges the CLIL classroom, because talking is not something that is very easy for children who are very little, for the young learners. They want to do it. They're very motivated to do it, but their command of language is very limited. So we have to activate language and thought very consciously, very deliberately. We can't just sort of imagine it's going to happen by magic. It won't. We have to do it deliberately. Okay. I'm going to, as we're going through the session, I'm going to stop at certain, right in the middle, and then again at the end, so that you can ask some questions. Okay. So what we came up with was this framework. I mean, the word ideas is a nice idea for teaching, because it's about ideas, isn't it? It's about having ideas and transmitting ideas and expressing ideas and challenging ideas. And it's all this sort of stuff that's going on your head and what you do when it comes out of your mouth, basically. And so we took these 5 letters, and we've broken down the framework into 5 stages. So the investigate stage, the discover, explore, apply, and summarize. And so what I'd like to do now is take you through these 5 stages. I'll show you more or less what's different about each stage, and then some examples of what we would be working with at each stage and how we would be working. I should point out now that the examples I'm going to give you are not all from the same age group, and they're not all from the same book. I've sort of tried to give you a spread of different ones, so that you can see how things develop from the very simple to the more complex. Okay, let's start off with this one then. Investigate. Okay, well, there are lots of sort of expressions of what a child's mind is like. I remember the famous expression, a child's mind is a blank slate. There's nothing in it. We as teachers fill it up with knowledge. This is absolute nonsense. Children have lots of things in their minds. They have lots of knowledge. They always know something. But their knowledge can be very informal, it can be very messy, it can be very disorganized, it might even be wrong. So whether or not it's knowledge is a different question. But it's what we want them to do, though, is we want to make them aware of the fact that this knowledge exists, that they have this knowledge, because very often they don't realize that they do. You've seen this as teachers, where you ask the children a question and they go, I don't know. And then you prod that question a little bit more, and you give them a little, and then they go, yes, I know what you're talking about. So they will quite often deny that they actually have this knowledge. And what we're trying to do is bring it to the fore of their minds. We're trying to get them to realize, first of all, they have it, what they can do with it, and what they can connect it to. Because we want to contextualize what they're going to go on to do in the discover stage. And before we do that, we want to get them thinking in the right frame of mind. We want to also make sure that they have a scaffolding of language, so that they've got essential words that they might need in order to do the next stage. We often do this stage using very open questions. Open questions rather than closed questions, because with closed questions you tend to get yes, no as the answer. Right? But there's not much thinking going on there, is it? It's just almost like an automatic answer. Whereas an open question encourages them to actually investigate the question further, to move it along a bit more. Also, we might actually get different answers when we've got open questions, and that gives us a very good opportunity for having some kind of talking going on in the classroom, contrasting, comparing. And this is where we would want to use cooperative learning, because when you want children to think about something, they're not very good at doing it on their own. Not just children, adults aren't either. None of us are very good at thinking, and thinking is a very collective thing. It's not a private individual thing. We think much better when we think together in a group, because somebody says something and then somebody says something else and somebody says, oh, that's a good idea, but I've thought of this. So you get people firing ideas off each other. Okay, so this is an example of a simple question that I'm going to ask them as an investigate question. What can you see in the sky during the daytime? Could you just jot down a few ideas of what you can see in the sky during the daytime, and then we'll have a look. Okay, this is what the kids might have come up with. Okay. Selection of things: rainbow, the sun, clouds, birds, lightning, insects, plane, drone, helicopter. Now, some children will be able to write these words. This is going to depend on the age group that you're dealing with. Some children will just be able to draw things. Well, that's fine. They can just draw things if you want. They can draw a rainbow, they can draw the sun, they can draw the clouds, birds, lightning. I mean, they're not difficult things to draw. So they could draw them, they could write the words, they could do both. Yeah. Do you remember what I said just in the previous slide about thinking isn't something that happens very well on your own? Now, I don't know how many of you will have got all of these ideas, but I bet you haven't. But I bet if you'd all been sitting together instead of everybody sitting on their own at home, I bet you would have got all these ideas, right? Because what happens when one mind challenges another mind? So one child will say, the sun and clouds, and the other one say, yeah, and he wants to say something. He really wants to participate in this activity that we're doing. So he'll think very, very, oh, birds. And then the other person in the group will say, oh, what can I say? Oh, an aeroplane. Do you see what I mean about firing ideas? And that's how collective thinking is much more successful almost than individual thinking. That's quite a paradox, isn't it? Because we think of thinking as being something that goes on inside our heads. It's very personal, it's very private, but it isn't. It's actually out there in the middle somewhere. We do it together. It's much better when we do it together. So now I've set them up with this little activity because I wanted to get the language out first of all, because this is the language I'm going to need. So I've asked them this, we've got the language. Now let's take them a little bit further. Let's push it a little bit further. Okay, so I can do there's various things I could do, but because these children are quite little, I'm going to have a go at classifying. Classifying is a really, really important activity for young children, because it's how they organize the world around them. That's how they do it. They classify things. A lot of the classifications that we do in science classes and even in language classes to a certain extent are actually quite artificial things. I mean, you think about the classification between a tree, a bush, and a grass. Well, that's just like a human thing that we've done. There's not really that difference in there, but we actually need to classify things in order to be able to control and organize things, in order to be able to fit them inside our minds. And children have a lot of difficulty with this. And it's a very important learning technique. So I'm going to ask them to classify objects into natural and man-made. I think they can probably do this quite easily. That's probably the easiest classification. Okay, so I'll get them to use colors. I've got the colors there on the words. They can use the same colors, and they can either color the word, or they can write the word in the color, or they can draw around the picture or draw the frame. And then I'm going to ask them to classify the objects into non-living and living. Now, this is more difficult because children actually resist the idea that something like the sun or a rainbow is a non-living thing, because they tend to associate living with natural. It's in nature. It exists there, but of course it isn't living. Yeah. And so again, I'm pushing that ability to classify a little bit further. By working in this way, first of all, I asked them to think about what they already knew. We expanded on that by making sure that they worked together. So this got much richer. I asked them to do something with that's quite simple. And then I pushed it a little bit further. And each time They are reinforcing the language because they're using the same words over and over again, but they're doing something different with it each time. But also it's pushing the concepts forward, isn't it? So we start off first of all where it's just a picture and a word as a label, and now we're pushing these concepts out. With the texture, if you like, of the concept is getting richer. Okay, let's move on. Discover. All right. Well, learning is all about discovering, isn't it? I mean, I don't know how many of you have heard of the discovery method. There's actually a method of learning called the discovery method. It's a kind of journey, right? We go on this journey and our learning journey, if you like, and we move forwards and we discover all these different things as we move. Some of the things we discover because people tell us, and other things we discover because we find them out for ourselves. And in a sense, it's a perfect expression of what learning is. It's discovering things in the world. And I think that one of the skills that we have to teach children, which is very, very important for engaging in this journey, is that discovering is about asking lots of questions. Right? That's how you do it. That's how you find things out. You find things out because you ask questions. You can ask questions to your teacher, you can ask your parents, you can ask your peers, and you can ask yourself. Right? And that self-questioning is very important. Right? I wonder why such and such a thing happens. That's asking questions. When we give the children information, I mean, this is the discovery section of the ideas framework, is the sort of main input of ideas, right? Of facts, of information. And each sentence or each question contains one piece of information. You have to pace it like this because we know what happens with young learners if lots of pieces of information are in the same sentence. They just get completely lost. So we pace it very simply, one simple sentence. Yeah. We highlight keywords and concepts. This is very important because for study skills later on, when they look at this piece of text, they've got these sort of like flashes across the text which light up, which give them the key concepts, the key ideas, and they can then use this for reformulating the ideas, for saying it in their own words, if you like. We also give the children just enough facts, okay? The factual information doesn't have to be, and I don't think it should be, all input. I think the input should be limited to the absolutely necessary facts that the children need in order to be able to move forwards. But I also think that the factual bit, should contain a lot of output as well. We want children to do things in order to discover. We don't need to discover. We already did that. They're the ones who need to be doing the discovery. So we can't be doing it for them all the time. Just enough. We want to present the facts very gradually, and we want to intersperse these with activities to keep checking their understanding. We know what happens if we give children a whole page of text. Just goes in one ear and out the other. It's too much for them to cope with. So we give it to them in small doses, and we keep checking, we keep checking, we keep checking. And as we're sort of feeding this information in, we're trying to encourage the children to be making connections. Learning is about making connections as well as about discovering. So I can connect that idea that I'm learning today with the idea I learned last week, which is probably in a different subject area, but it's connected, right? And this gives a very rich sort of fabric, if you like, of knowledge, not something that's so sterile and so factual. You get a much richer texture. And finally, I would encourage you very strongly to forget about definitions. There's a sort of, I don't know where that came from, this idea that definitions, if you can define something, you know what it is. And that's just nonsense. You can try this with your own students. You can give them a load of definitions to learn, tell them to go away and learn them. You can test them on the definitions. Many of them will get them right because they're obedient, and children know what it means to put their elbows on the table and learn something off by heart. They've done it many times before. They'll do it. And then you can check. You can tell them to put the exam away, and you can ask them to explain it, and they won't be able to. At least most of them won't be able to. And you can try something else as well. You can wait for a couple of weeks, and you can test them again without telling them. and they'll have forgotten it. And that's because this kind of knowledge, if you can call it knowledge at all, is so surface level that there's no impact further down. It just floats there on the surface, and eventually it just almost like anything that's floating on the surface, it just dissipates. It goes. So forget about definitions. It doesn't matter if they can't define things. There are lots of things that we can't define. What we want to make sure is, can they use it? Do they understand it? We can tell whether they know what we're talking about just by asking all these questions: what, where, who, why, when, okay? Most children would have no idea. I think I better use that in case I drop that on the floor. Most children would have no idea how to define gravity. But if I hold this bottle up in a classroom and hold it out like that and say, what's going to happen if I let go? What's going to happen? I think it would be extremely unusual for any child to say anything other than it's going to fall down. And what's more, if I say, let's test it, and I let go, everybody will look down. They're not going to look up to see if it floats up in the air. Right? So they can't define what gravity is. They might even not know what the word is, but they do know what it is. And that's what we have to focus on, not definitions and theory. Okay, let's move on. Okay, in the investigate stage, you remember we just had we had vocabulary which we played around with in different ways. And by playing around in different ways, we brought on different concepts. So we had birds and insects. These are some of the paths, some of the discovery paths that might come out of an investigate activity like that. Okay, we're just going to choose one, but this is just to give you an idea of all these connections that can be made. We've been speaking about how important it is to make connections. So we could talk about migration, we could talk about flying machines, so we could have something on technology. We've got energy, so we could have something on physics, which is the sun and the lightning, they provide energy. We've got the weather, the clouds and the rainbow are elements of weather. We've got the water cycle, because the sun and the clouds form the water cycle. And then if we want to get very technical, because the kids are right up there in sexto, we could talk about the Earth's spheres. We've got the biosphere and the troposphere, because you could actually divide the same way as we classified those words into natural and non-natural and natural and man-made, living and non-living. We could also divide them into the biosphere and the troposphere, because they are actually sectioned off into those different areas. So we can choose lots of different paths. I'm just going to choose migration. I'm just going to choose one as an example to show you what I mean. Okay, so here's a text. This is our discovery text. This is our main input of information. Remember though, I'm not just interested in input, I want output too. We start off with something very simple, which is just basic general information. I'm not defining migration, but I'm just telling them how it happens, as it were. And that the animals migrate over land, air, and water. Let's have a look at some of the features of the text. You can see there the highlighting: land, air, water, food, weather, reproduce. All these words have been highlighted so that the children can look at these words. I could even say to them, write these words down on a piece of paper, close your books, and now tell me about migration, because they're almost like the cues that they need. Yeah. Very general information. Then we've got information in different formats. We've got it in as bullet points. Bullet points is very to the point, very simple sentences. Food supplies run out after summer. Boom, that's it. It's a very, very simple way of presenting different pieces of information. It's also a very useful way of presenting something that they find very easy to remember, which is how many pieces of information there are there. Because maybe I can ask them, can you tell me the 3 ways? The 3 reasons why animals migrate, and they can remember, oh yes, the 3 reasons, we've got this one and this one and this one. Okay, it's a very good memory technique. We've also got simple sentences, right? As we have, how do they know when to migrate? Right, so I can put that into a simple sentence. We've got information in the form of visuals, of pictures, breaking up the text so that we don't have such a lot of text all at once. Yeah. And these pictures contextualize the information that we're giving them. If we didn't have any pictures there, the children would have to try and imagine these things in their heads. Now, we're going to ask them to do that later, just a little bit later. But at first, I want to give them something to hang on to. Let's move on to the next one. What are we going to do with this? Okay, I could ask them, now we're talking about the output. I could say, choose the words. In the spring, birds fly. Well, it depends where you live, doesn't it? North or south? Yeah. And then I'll say, and why is that? Well, because they're looking for food, or because it's getting very cold. Yeah. And the same with the autumn. So by asking a question, which links through to information that the children have from previous lessons, I can get them to sort of rethink about, to reformulate the ideas that they've learned in this discovery section. I could ask them to complete a chart. And in order to complete the chart, I can give them a selection of animals or not, depending on, again, their cognitive and their linguistic stage. But notice I put afterwards, add your own ideas. This is extremely important. We don't want to limit children to what we're teaching them. We want to know what they can do, which is very often much more than we're teaching them. Add your own ideas. Some children might just give you one word. Some children might give you one animal for each column. Some children might give you 5 animals for each column, and that's fine. That's fine. Each child is working at his or her own level within the classroom. But what we don't want to do is to cut them off. We don't want to say to them, add 2 words. No, just add your own ideas. Do what you can with it. Answer the questions. Now what I want them to do is I want them to reason about the information. I've given them this information. Now let's try reasoning. Let's getting these thinking skills moving. Okay. Why do you think the food supplies run out after the summer? I wouldn't want them to answer these questions. I don't want them to write answers to these questions. I want them to actually explore the question itself and to think about it. They can do this in groups. They can do it in pairs. Well, because plants stop growing, don't they? I mean, plants in the autumn stop growing, and in the winter they don't grow at all, a lot of them. So there's no plant food. And if some animals are migrating, there might not even be any other animal food for the animals that need other animals. So that's why the supplies run out. How about salmon? Because remember we had these pictures here. Yeah, the salmon migrating. Salmon, they migrate from rivers to the ocean, which is where they reproduce. That's why they migrate for reproduction. They don't really care about the weather or the amount of food, because that's much more stable in the aquatic environment. So how do you think they know the difference between the river and the ocean? How do they know they've got there, as it were? Well, what's the difference between the water in the rivers and the water in the ocean? You can ask these questions and oh yes, well, the water in the ocean is salty water, it's salt water, and the river's fresh water. Maybe they notice this. Maybe they do notice this. I mean, after all, they live in it, so they should notice it, shouldn't they? Yeah. Maybe there's a difference in temperature from one place to the other. Okay. And elephants. Elephants have got really good memories. How do you think they migrate? Let's have a look at the elephants again there. So maybe as they're migrating, they're wandering along through the savannah, and then there's that mountain that's always there. Every year they walk past it. And then they come to a river and they have to cross the river. And then they carry on walking, and over there's the lake, which has all the dangerous crocodiles in it. And then they walk a bit further and they come to the forest, which has got the first fruit. And they're so hungry by this stage. It tastes wonderful. Okay. And you want to encourage the children to think, to reason, to rationalize in this way for 2 reasons. First of all, because it's very important that there's a lot going on up here, that it's not just picking up on words in the text and just putting them together in a different way. They're actually thinking about it. But also, you want to encourage them to imagine what's going on here. I call this, getting the words off the page of the book, because words on a page don't really mean much to children. It's when those words are inside their minds and they can picture, and they're actually creating pictures in their minds. That's when you're getting rich thought coming through. Okay, so all of this section here, I'm not really interested in whether or not the kids get the right answer. I don't even know if there is a right answer. Quite honestly, from what I do know about migration is there's an awful lot of incognito about it. There's lots of things we don't know, but it doesn't stop us from thinking about it, from trying to rationalize, from trying to reason and imagine. Okay, we could stop for a few moments now for you to think about if they've got any questions that you'd like to ask. I just put a couple of ideas there. You might want to ask about the types of questions, because I've been talking a lot about how important it is to keep questioning. You might want to ask me about the dynamics of these stages. Do they work alone? Do they work in pairs? Do they work? It's up to you. Or other questions, other ideas. I'll give you a few moments to think about that. Let's have a look. Okay.
There are some questions coming in.
Okay.
What question should we use? Is it okay to use L1, for example?
Okay. Right. That's a very controversial question, isn't it? Or like, who asked this question? I don't know if Brian's still there. Okay, well, I'm sorry, I don't know your name, the person who asked this question. Can you use L1? I would say no, because I follow a rule with my work with children is I don't use L1. I always use L2. So I always speak to the children in English, but I'm fully aware of the fact that children will have to often respond in Spanish or in their mother tongue, okay, whatever that might be. And as they do that, I will encourage them to mix, if they like, make sure get some English in there. So if they say something to me in L1, which I know they can say in English, I'll say, oh, come on, you can say that to me in English. Now say it again and tell me in English. I personally think that as teachers, we have to try to stick to the formula that we speak English to them, but we understand them when they speak to us in L1, and we recognize that it's absolutely natural that they are using L1. So one thing is the teacher to the student, and the other thing is the student to the teacher. I don't think that teachers should police their classrooms preventing L1. I think that's a complete waste of time. I also think it's actually quite noxious, because if you don't let children express themselves, if you don't help them to express themselves, they will eventually give up and they'll stop expressing themselves, and we don't want that. So rather than preventing it, we need to facilitate it. But we do it in L1. Other people disagree with me. Are there any other questions?
There are some questions. Let's see. Should we correct children's speech in L2, for example?
Yes, I think there's always a balance, isn't there, between correcting, because it can be very positive and because it can actually even be quite motivating, and correcting in such a way that you send them into a spiral of despair, because if you correct every single word that they say, it'll have the same effect as if you don't let them speak. If you don't let them say anything in their mother tongue, they'll just give up and they'll stop doing it. So we always have to have a balance there. And there's always, I always remember that years ago there was the question between accuracy and fluency, and which is most important. And that, I think, one of the things that I've observed quite a lot when I've been doing classroom observations with teachers is that particularly non-native speakers of English as teachers tend to be much, much harder and much more exacting on the children than, for example, I would be. Because I think it's normal for children to make mistakes. I think it's normal for native speakers to make mistakes. I mean, you should see the spelling mistakes that English children make when they write something in English. It's their language. They make dreadful spelling mistakes. But I would never, ever want to discourage them from actually doing it. So you have to try and find a way to correct that isn't discouraging. that is something that is actually positive.
And I think Raquel Marquez has said open questions. We want open questions because we don't mind mistakes. We want the
Yeah,
language. So I think she's kind of
yeah,
saying what you're saying there as well.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, definitely.
Um, we we have as well a question here about the instruments as well that they use for questioning. Someone's talking about, for example, different types of technology, uh, iPads, dictionaries, books. What are the instruments that you would use to get children questioning things?
In the sense that you want to send them out on a sort of discovery thing. I mean, again, it's very easy for people, for example, of my generation, to be total Luddites and say, "Oh no, we need books, we need books. Everything has to be going on. We don't want them playing around on iPads." Our children live in a digital world. And this is the world they were born into. I mean, the children that we have in our classroom were born into this digital world. Why are we sort of preserving some kind of ideal of the past within our classrooms? I don't agree with that at all. I think everything is a possible opportunity for learning, whether it's a book, whether it's a dictionary, whether it's an iPad or a mobile phone. However, I have very much the same opinion about digital tools as I used to have, and I still do have, about microwaves. I remember when microwaves first came in, and I had one, and I tried cooking everything in the microwave because I thought it was the bee's knees. I thought it was going to be wonderful. Well, actually, it's only good for certain things, and for other things, it's really quite rubbish. Well, it's the same with what tools we use. We can use any tool, but the appropriate tool for the appropriate task, rather than forcing a use of tools or prohibiting a use of tools. I think we just need to be more relaxed about it and see opportunities everywhere and in lots of different tools.
Maybe just one more quick and very practical question before we move on. Um, Speaking about involving children in this questioning process, how do you
Mm,
do that?
mm,
Because a lot of teachers are in this situation
mm,
in a big group, if you have a big group of
mm,
students.
mm, mm. I mean, one of the things that I quite like doing with children is to present them at the beginning. If we were starting a theme, you might present them with what we call, I mean, this is actually a pedagogical technique which is used quite a lot these days. You present them with what we call a big question, so a big issue. Yeah. And then you break it down. And I think that you want to break it down, first of all, into very simple things that they've certainly got the language to deal with. And you can sit them in little groups and ask them to examine certain questions. So you could give them a list of, say, 3 or 4 questions. I mean, if you think about the thing that we did with the birds and the migrating and things like that, you could think of sort of 3 or 4 very simple questions, and you get them sitting there. They can talk to each other. Obviously, there's going to be a certain amount of L1. There always will be. And I think we just have to knock this on the head finally. It is utterly unnatural for children who are Spanish speakers or Polish speakers or Italian speakers not to speak to each other in their mother tongue. I mean, it's just a very unnatural situation. Okay. It's also very, very normal for children who really are bilingual to make a mishmash of languages. I mean, I have a grandson who's 3 years old, and he makes a real mixture of English and Spanish, but it doesn't matter. He expresses himself. It's fine. So I think we have to allow that to happen. But probably the most important thing is that we have to model it for them. So we have to model for the children what it is to be asking these questions. We stand there in the class and we say, well, I wonder why that happens. Has anybody got any idea? Shall we investigate this? Come on then, let's think about it. So you're actually modeling this way of thinking. Questioning is a way of thinking. And the questions are almost inevitably and invariably much more important than the answers. Answers can go like that. Questions, really, your mind has to be working pretty well to ask a good question. And I think that the other way to do it is to be very encouraging, so that when a child asks an interesting question, you make a big thing of it. You know what? That's a really good question. Right. Can anybody answer that? Okay, let's think about it. Break it down into smaller pieces. That makes it easier for them to think about. But what we tend to do as teachers most of the time is that we make a big thing about correct answers, but we don't make a big thing about good questions. Correct answers really I'm not interested in. What I'm interested in is the ability to formulate good questions, because I know that that involves a lot more thinking. Shall we move on?
Yes, I think so. I think that's enough for now.
Okay. Right, let's see. Sorry, I'm going to have to put this up again. My computer's doing silly things. So we've talked about investigate, we've talked about discover. Now let's get on to explore. Discover is where we gave them the sort of like the most of the there was most of the input, most of the information going in, the basic information. This is if you like is the content that we're dealing with. But I want it to go a bit further. I want to push it a little bit forward. I want them to explore this a little bit more. You see there that I said pull the students up from the lots to the hots. For those of you, I don't know if you're all familiar with this, lots are lower order thinking skills and hots are higher order thinking skills. Okay, so the lower order thinking skills are things like remembering, memorizing, understanding, maybe a little bit of analysing, but not very much. It's just sort of very simple things. And then the higher order thinking skills is where we sort of kick the whole brain thing into a completely different sphere, where they're using this information in a very different way. So the skills involved, the thinking skills involved in these two different stages, if you like, are quite different. However, it's not that one is more important than the other, or that we can forget about the lots because the thing we're really interested in is the hots, because the hots are dependent on the lots. So you have to go in that order. I mean, no matter how smart a small child were, they couldn't go straight to the hots. They have to go through the lots because it's a sort of building process, if you like. But because the lots, by the time they get to a certain age, are actually quite easy, of course, children are very happy just to sort of bask in this zone of comfort where I don't really have to think too hard and I'm not going to be challenged. And more importantly, I'm going to get everything right. Everybody likes getting everything right. And one of the differences between the lots and the hots is that the hots is it's a risk zone. You're much more likely to make a mistake when you're applying higher order thinking skills than when you're applying the lower order thinking skills, because they're easier. Yeah. And so children will often resist being pushed up into this thing. Oh, no, I don't know. I can't do that. I can't do that. And it's our job as teachers to encourage them precisely by taking away the fear, if you like, of this risk. I think it's also really important to challenge their thinking. It's more actually as they get a little bit older, where if you ask them a question, if they come up with an opinion, you say, but why do you think that? They'll say, well, because I do, because it's my opinion. Well, that's not a good enough reason, right? Some opinions are good opinions and other opinions are bad opinions. Good opinions are backed up with good reasons. Bad opinions are just nonsense. Okay, there's nothing wrong with explaining that to them. So challenge their thinking, get them to rationalize, get them to give you reasons, and also encourage them to challenge each other as well, and even to challenge you, so that that it's not just I give an answer, but it's that I give an answer and I back it up and I rationalize it, I justify it. Okay. And remember that when we're talking about exploring, when we're talking about going from the lots to the hots, we don't want the children just to become little encyclopedias by just stuffing more and more and more and more knowledge into their brains. That's really not very useful. Because we do have encyclopedias, and of course we've got something even better now. We've got Google. So why do you want to carry it all around inside your head? What we want them to do is we want them to go to push the thinking a bit further. We want them to go down under the surface. We want it to go deeper, and we want them to look at the full scope of the concepts that we're dealing with. So we want to go wider. So it's further, deeper, wider, not more. All right. And I know I can't see you all. I wish I could, but I'm just imagining you sitting there thinking, yeah. And isn't it nice that that's changing? Because when we were kids, I know when I was, it was all about how much you knew, not about how well you knew it. And I think we really do need to make a change there. We want the children to constantly we want to constantly encourage them to making connections with other things they've learned, something they learned last week, something that's from a different subject area, something that they didn't even learn at school that they learned maybe at home or on summer camp or whatever. Okay, so we want them to understand that knowledge is almost like a web. It's all these connections. You could even sort of think about the whole brain thing and about how you've got these synapses and these connections across the brain. Just in case you're not familiar with the higher order thinking skills, I just put a list up there for you. So you've got sort of using information in new situations and interpreting it. So what do you understand by this information? What does it tell you? How far does it take you? You want them to analyze information. You want to make comparisons, draw back on things, forwards on things. Experiments are great things for doing because it's a hands-on thing. They're actually touching things. And before they do an experiment, you might ask them to hypothesize. So you can say to them, okay, before you mix those different objects with water, for example, what do you think is going to happen to them? Do you think something's going to float? Do you think something is going to become a solution? Do you think you're going to be able to see it? Is it going to sink to the bottom? What do you think? Right? Now do it. What were your hypotheses good? Were they correct? Which ones did you get right? Okay, so the reason why it's quite important for the kids to be able to hypothesize is because there's a stage in their education where they have to move. You see this very easily in maths, yes? When you ask a young child, what's 2 and 2? They go 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? So they need their fingers to be able to do it. Now, we don't want them doing this when they're 14. It's fine when they're 4. But if they were doing it when they were 14, we'd be very worried, because what we want them to do is to transfer all this action stuff into here. We want them to be able to do it mentally. And this is what you're doing when you're asking children to hypothesize about something. Imagine that. What do you think happens? Okay, I better move on because I do tend to finish up with not enough time. Right. So we get to the explore stage here. Done the investigate, we've done the discover, and now I'm moving in upper level, so I'm going sort of into a much higher level within the primary area, and I want to explore this idea of migration, because of course people migrate, not just animals, but people migrate too. And it's quite possible that you have children in your class who come from families that have migrated or who have even migrated themselves. So let's just have a look at this. I think when we're dealing with sort of these sort of big ideas like migration, it's really important, especially when we're talking about people, that we give them something realistic to hold on to, which is why I've contextualized it with pictures and with some information, because if I just give it to them as textual information, they're very likely, well, it just sort of goes over their heads. They can't associate with it. So I've got some pictures here and I've got some pieces of text. The first thing I want them to do is to match that. So so they can read this. Daniel and Sarah live and work in Berlin. They moved there because there was no work for them in their country. So I want to ask them now to find a picture of the people they think are Daniel and Sarah. Okay, I don't know if you're there, Brian.
Yes, I'm here.
You are. Could you find that picture for me? The picture of Daniel and Sarah?
I think it's picture 3.
Okay, good. So what the children can do is they can find clues. They can find picture clues and they can find clues in the text. The first clue in the text is there's 2 people. Well, there's 2 photographs with 2 people in each photograph. That's 3 and 4. But then 4, these people look a bit older. They don't look like they're actually working, do they? Well, maybe that's the next one. Maybe this is Karen and Ian who are retired and they've gone from England to Alicante. Yes, that looks more like them. So I know now that Daniel and Sarah are number 3. Okay, these are skills, right? These are the skills that children need to be able to work with text. They need to be able to scan this text, to look at this text, and not just understand it, but to recognize that there is information in that text, information that they can extract and use in some way. So the first thing I've asked them to do is match the pictures to the information. Now, if I were talking about human migration, number 2, that's where the real content is there. So that there are 4 reasons for human migration: economic, political, social, environmental. As you can imagine, if I said that to a 10-year-old, he wouldn't take any notice of me, because it's just, there's nothing there for a child to hang on to. It's just sort of words floating around. But now we've seen these pictures, these people have become real for us. We've got some text there to explain things to us. I can actually say, okay, let's have a look at the Nansen family. The Nansen family, that's number one. They moved to Australia a year ago. The sea levels on their island are rising, and their farm is now completely flooded. So, why did they move? Did they move for economic reasons, political reasons, social reasons, or environmental reasons? Well, the answer is environmental reasons, because we're talking here about these very low-lying islands, which eventually will be completely flooded because the sea levels are rising. Okay, so it makes sense to introduce this kind of sort of theoretical, factual stuff once the children are really well embedded in some kind of context. I might then ask them which people migrated because they wanted to. Okay, some people go because they want to, some people go because they have to. Well, if I look down that list and I look down all that information there, I reckon the only people who went because they wanted to go are Karen and Ian, because they went because the weather's better and they love the lifestyle. Everybody else had other reasons for going. Yeah. And which people migrated because they had to. They absolutely had to. Well, clearly, the Nansen family, number one, they had no choice because their farm doesn't exist anymore. It's under the sea. And the people in picture two, well, they migrated because of political reasons, because there's a war in the north of their country, or so in the south of their country. So they've moved north because there's a war. So that's pretty much, you have to go, isn't it? And which people migrated within the same country? Okay, you can ask this because the children can understand this. If you ask them to think about their own families, how many have you got grandparents who have migrated from the villages to the cities? Okay, well, that's number two. Yeah, because they've moved to the north of their country because of the south. And then another question, do you think any of these people will go back to their hometowns? Why? Why will they go back? I don't think Karen and Ian are going back because they love the lifestyle, so they're not going back. Okay. I don't think the Nansen family are going back because they can't go back because they don't have anywhere to go back to. I think number two, I think that the Sabur family will go back if things become peaceful where they used to live. And maybe even Daniel and Sarah will go back if they can find work in their country. Now, those issues there about migration, if you actually look at the technical thing about migration, there's all sorts of technical words about internal migration, return migration. None of this means anything to kids. But if you present it like this, it does, in a way in which they can think about it. They can explore these issues. They can work in groups. They can talk about it. They can then discuss their answers with the whole group.
Just a very quick question,
Yes.
Susan.
Sorry, I got a shock then.
No, sorry. We had a question about what level or what age children that might be, that last activity might be for, and also a related question, how you might scaffold their language to help them to produce an oral or written response to those types of questions, which are quite complex questions. So.
Oh yes, they are indeed. Yeah, they are indeed. Okay, when you first of all, the age group. I mean, something like this one that we just, this previous page of activity, well, screen of activities that we've done. I mean, this is not something. I mean, I wouldn't be attempting something like this until the children were perhaps in 5th grade. But just because of the whole conceptual stuff that's going on, never mind about the language, right? But this idea that people have to migrate, or people migrate because they want to, and the whole sort of notion of migration is actually quite complicated. And it's not just complicated, it's probably something, unless a child has actually been through it, and there will be some children that have been through it, but the other children will simply have no notion what this is like. You could actually use it maybe to ask the children who have been through it to talk about their experiences, but these are very alien experiences unless you've been through them, especially for children. So I would think this is more quinto, 5th grade, 6th grade, something like that. Scaffolding of language. Okay, well, You do this in various different ways. You can scaffold. There's a very sort of formulaic way of scaffolding, which I'm not that in favour of, which is where you give children what we call predictive skeletons. So you give them a sentence which has words in which they move in order to create other sentences. I mean, we've seen this a lot, for example, in ELT, where you have a role play. What do you like doing? I like swimming. They changed the word swimming. And what do you like doing? Oh, I like running. And so this is what we call the predictive model. The problem with the predictive model is that the children are not expressing their ideas. What they're doing is making the model fit the activity. But it can be very, very divorced from what they actually want to express. And my experience with children is that if it's something that they want to say, they're going to work much harder at doing it than if it's something that they think that you want them to say. Okay, so you have to scaffold, first of all, in a very informal way. Walking around, they'll be speaking to you in their mother tongue. You formulate it back again in English. So when they say something like, "Bueno, pues mis tíos vinieron del pueblo." Oh, your uncle and aunt came from the village, did they? And when did they come? When did they come from the village? And you make sure that you repeat it several times so that you're scaffolding like that. Okay. You can also scaffold in the way that we said in the Discover section by highlighting key things. That's a form of scaffolding as well. But I think the answer to scaffolding is it's something you have to be doing all the time, constantly. You keep repeating it, you keep doing it, and you do it out loud. I'm more worried about verbal scaffolding than I am about written scaffolding, because when children write, they always have the models, the written models, in their books. The problem is the oral model, because it goes, it dissipates, it's gone once it's said, and that makes it much more difficult. I hope that's answered.
Yes, I think so. Yeah, we
Okay.
can probably move on.
Shall we move on? Apply. All right then. Now, we've investigated some things that we knew at the beginning. We've discovered something new. We've explored those concepts a little bit further. But now I want total output. So in the other levels, the other stages have been very much input, output, like this from the child. Lots and lots of output as well as lots of not probably more output than input. But the application stage, I want it almost exclusively output. I want to see what they can do with this knowledge. I want to see how they can connect it in different ways. And the only way you can really check knowledge is by getting them to apply it. There's no point in checking memory of facts, okay? Because again, it's a little bit like that business of when I said before, you know, you can get them to learn a whole load of definitions, but then test them again in 2 months' time and they've forgotten them. Right, so it's not really checking very much. And one of the things that works very well at this stage is these problem-solving, task-based activities where you sit them together and get them to work something out. Here's an example. This is from probably top primary I'd be doing this with. So you're a member of a team of space explorers and you're going to start a colony on Mars, and this is your task. So I set the problem to them. And then I want them to make a list of problems, but I want them to think. I give them cues as to what they have to do here. If they were older, I would expect them to do it on their own, but little ones can't really do that. They'll just sort of sit there going like this. So there's no point, because that's not the critical part of the activity. So let's push them on a little bit. You've got to think about your natural resources. You need food, you need homes, you need clean water, you need oxygen. Draw this, explain how you're going to provide it. You've got to recycle waste, right? Because you're going to have waste. Where people make lots of rubbish. So what are you going to do with it? Yeah. I want you to give me a name for your colony. I want you to write a description of your colony. And then you need to take people with you, because a colony will only survive if it's got people there. So you have to present your colony to the rest of class and persuade your classmates to join your team, right? What are you going to do to persuade them? Are you going to pay them? Are you going to offer them all sorts of perks? What are you going to do to persuade them to join you? And in the end, we'll hold a class vote and decide which is the most popular colony. And of course, we'll give reasons, okay? And you set them off working on that. And this is where you see the importance of the collective at work, the collective mind, the children working together, coming up with all these different ideas. Okay. Summarize. Right at the end, I mean, this is a pretty standard formula for a unit of work, if you like, but I want them to try and bring all these different pieces together, because remember, what we've done throughout the unit is we've presented sort of little nuggets, if you like, of information to discover, to investigate, to discover, to explore, and then to apply. And we've done all this all the way through, and now we want to try and pull all these different strands together. Again, get them to be connecting. Yeah. And I want to give them an opportunity to check their knowledge, to check their skills. This isn't a test. I'm not testing them. It's not an exam. But it's a little bit like when I go shopping, I take a list with me and I tick things off. I've got that. I've got that. I haven't got that. I wonder which aisle that was in. I'll go back. Let the children go back in their books. Let them go back and look for it. Very often, they can't quite remember it, but they do know where it is, right? So they go back and find it. I'm quite happy for them to work again as a cooperative in this, to work together. I don't think necessarily that you have to have children, you do all this lovely cooperative work, and then when it comes down to the summarizing, you make them do it on their own. I mean, that seems to me a little bit crazy, because it's sort of breaking with the pattern of the dynamics of the classroom. But you're giving them this opportunity to actually pull all this information together. Okay, so that's the end there. We've got 5 stages, yeah, for activating thought and language. The children are going to receive, so that's the input. They're going to transform it, and they're going to use it, so that's the output, yeah, at every stage. So notice that we're breaking a little bit with that idea where you have, also sort of the controlled bit at the beginning where the children don't really do anything. No, we've got them doing something right from the beginning. And remember something, teachers often worry about this business about languages. Bilingual does mean 2 languages. It means there are 2 languages going on at the same time. Not that there's one foreign language, but that you have 2 languages going on. And it's very natural for a lot of children in the world to be in this situation. I would always suggest that the input from the materials and the teachers should be in English. I think it's really important that you're providing this model, especially if we're worrying about something like scaffolding, because if you're speaking in L2, you're not scaffolding. Don't worry about children mixing languages. There's nothing unnatural about that. It's perfectly normal. And as they get older, they will separate them. And you really must support their attempt to express themselves. Show them that you're interested in what they have to say, that you're going to help them say it, right? You can model the correct language, but you have to be very sensitive about how you correct their language. Okay, so those are our 5 stages. So thank you for joining us, and we can have a look at some more questions if anybody's got some more questions, if you're not all too exhausted.
I think there are 2 questions that did come up that we could probably deal with quite quickly.
Okay.
But one from a couple of related questions. I think I'll give them to you at the same time. Marina was asking. Obviously, this is we're talking about the ideas framework. They're both about the ideas framework. Marina was asking what kind of approach this method is based on. I don't know if you could maybe tell her where your ideas come from for the ideas framework. Yeah. And then also we got a question from Kate in Spain who asked if the ideas framework could be applied to her English classes. This is not a science class or a maths class, so not a content subject, but an English class, a language class. Could it also be applied to an English context?
Yeah, I mean, both very interesting questions. Marina, the question of the approach, I'm glad you asked me that, because I actually had it in my notes, but I forgot to say it. I was going to say when I got towards the end that one of the things that you might have noticed is that there seem to be quite a lot of different things going on. Okay, so we've got a little bit of the sort of discovery method. We've got some problem solving and some task-based stuff. We've got the cooperative learning going on, and there seems to be a lot of these things going on. And I think that what I feel very much about this is that learning it's quite messy. It's not a very tidy organized, everything in boxes. It doesn't really work like that. And so what we did when we developed the ideas framework was to try to apply the tactics, if you like, or the techniques that we thought best suited that stage in the cognitive process, rather than saying, oh, this is a whatever methodology. Well, actually, this is a framework, and within this framework, we move through different methodologies depending on what is best suited to the purposes the purpose that we have. I hope that answers that question. And Kate, yes, I would love to see the ideas framework being applied to different subject areas, because the ideas framework is a framework for cognitive development. And so, and because we think that cognitive development and linguistic development go hand in hand, it's a framework for both. But in a sense, it's much more a framework of thinking, of learning how to think, rather than learning how to conjugate a verb or something like that. So I don't see any reason at all why it shouldn't be attached to something like an ELT class. I think you asked about maths as well. I'm always very nervous about saying things about maths, because I always get told off that by maths teachers, and they tell me that maths is a very special subject and it has different rules. I'm not sure that that's true, but I'm sure that if maths is something which requires a lot of internal thinking, and that's very, very difficult for children to learn how to do. So I think that the ideas framework would work well with that, although I'm prepared to be told off if there's a maths teacher out there.
Okay, well, thank you very much for those. I think those are very interesting questions, very interesting answers as well. I know that many maths teachers would say that maths is in itself a language, and therefore quite
exactly.
different. You hear that quite often as well. There was also there were a few questions here we're not going to probably be able to get around to. There was one saying, asking here, it's rather an interesting question to ask an author, probably possibly dangerous. What is the best student book to follow your ideas of teaching? So I'll just let you deal with that.
Well, there is a series of books that are coming out this year, actually, which follow the ideas framework, which are the CLIL books, which we've been working on with Anaya, and we've sort of very much taken the curriculum that the children are having to deal with across the 6 levels of primary, and also sort of systematically worked through the contents, applying this framework of ideas, this framework for cognitive development, if you like. So I would have to say that that's probably the best thing to use. But you can, I mean, I always feel very embarrassed when people ask me about materials, because obviously I'm a writer, and so it's very easy for me to say, well, of course the best one is mine. And that makes me rather embarrassed. But what I would say is that whenever we're talking about a framework, remember that the most important resource in any classroom is the teacher. It's not the book. The teacher is the most important resource in any classroom. And so you can borrow, even if you're using different materials, you can borrow these ideas. You can apply this framework in your own way of working, if you like, by just by sort of following through the process, if you like, of developing the way that children are able to think about things.
Okay, thank you so much again, Susan. I also like to thank everyone out there for coming today and for attending the webinar. Yes, if you were interested in this webinar, I'm sure you'll be interested in the next 2 webinars in our series. Tomorrow we have Elizabeth Beer. She'll be speaking about reading. That is well, I can't remember the title of her talk. Read to Succeed tomorrow. Read to Succeed. And then on Thursday, Elena Marina, who's a teacher trainer for Pearson, will be talking about assessment with Assess for Success, both focused on the needs of primary teachers. So thank you once again for coming. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you.
Okay, and good night.
Good night.